Okay, so AS mock feedback. What I'd like you to do is I'd like to listen carefully to the information. Remember, the reason I've done it this way is so you can pause me. You can not necessarily skip past things you got full marks on because you still want to check, but also kind of move slightly more quickly through those, whereas things where you really didn't get any marks at all, I want to see people stopping and writing lots of information and detail down, making notes on how they could improve. So the very first question, you've got to describe Wundt's role in the development of psychology. And here it talks about knowledge of Wundt's role being generally accurate and mostly well detailed, evident or limited and lacks detail, coherent, some inaccuracies or substantially inaccurate and muddled, and specialist terminology is used effectively, appropriately or absent. So terminology is probably the one that let you down on this one, and the level of detail. It's a nice easy one. Generally I was quite pleased with most people, although bear in mind it is a 6-mark question, so it's not just about recalling facts, it's kind of telling you in a bit more detail. So Wundt was, lots of people talked about him being the father of psychology and moved from philosophy, roots in philosophy to controlled research. You also mentioned about him setting up the first psychology lab, which is great. That's brilliant that you remembered those. However, they are just purely knowledge based, so it's about a little bit more than that if you want to move higher. Moved away from psychology towards the scientific approach, and what you'd want to do to get the high marks is explain what that was. So if you didn't explain about controlled experiments, then you need to include them and explain what that means. Lots of people use the word objective though, which was really good, and controlled experiments. Promoted the use of introspection as a way of studying mental processes. Introspection is a research method, so it allows us to study the way that our mental processes work. So it's nothing else, it's not a theory or anything like that. It allows us to study that internal mental processes so that we can collect that data. So lots of other people maybe referred to it as theories or things like that. It's not that, it's just a way of collecting data. And then some people remember the wording exactly, which was brilliant. Systematic analysis of our own conscious experiences of a stimulus. I was a little bit surprised that some people couldn't explain this one in a bit more detail or chose not to, because we looked at it in class. You actually conducted it in class for this very reason, so you could explain it in detail. However, some people really impressed me with that really competent kind of explanation. So it's an experience was analysed in terms of its component parts, so sensations and emotional reactions. So that's when you broke it down. You said how it made you feel emotionally, but also physically. Did your jaw clench? Did you want to move away from things? What did you think? And then the one that would have got you the highest mark, so explaining introspection in detail rather than just naming it, would have sort of moved you up past 4. And then finally, to get the higher marks, he needed to talk about how he paved the way for controlled research and mental processes, and mention that it relates to cognitive psychology and behavioural psychology. So behavioural psychology was immediately after Wundt, and we only wanted to look at observable behaviours, but was really motivated by ensuring that behaviours were measurable. So that was really important. So you'd want to talk about how he was inspired kind of controlled research, and behavioural psychology is all based on only measuring observable behaviours, and then the cognitive psychologists with the internal mental processes. So Wundt wanted to explore things like sensation, emotional reaction, reaction time. All of those are things that cognitive psychologists look at. We want to study internal mental processes as well. So those bottom 2 are the ways you would access the higher marks. Then we have social learning theory, and again exactly the same thing. Specialist terminology is what held a lot of you back. So if you have a look here, look on the mark scheme, see where I placed you. If it was about inaccuracies or lack of detail. So if it's lack of detail, I would only be saying that knowledge is evident, and then some appropriate use of terminology, which is where a lot of you sat. So if we have a quick look here, you have your AO1 and your AO3. Now I know it says refer to evidence in your answer. What a lot of you did, which wasn't great, is start with Bandura straight away and explain the procedure, and didn't really identify anything beyond observation and imitation, which isn't really what we want, because you need to know about the social learning theory. It asks about the approach. It does not ask you about the research itself. Truly, it says outline and evaluate the social learning theory approach, refer to evidence. So you make references to evidence, you don't base your entire thing on the social learning theory. And if you have a look up there, there's actually no relevance or no reference to using the evidence in the mark scheme as well, although you do need to. So it's good you did, but you need to kind of temper that. Okay, introductory sentence, which a lot of you managed, learn through observation and imitation within a social context, some of you with perfect wording, which was excellent. And then the things I'd want you to talk about, so a role model, mention a role model, explain what they are, so they're behaviours that, they're people that we want to model the behaviour of, and then that would lead perfectly into identification and identity, and you'd need to explain what that was and give an example. So it's when somebody has similarities with a person and then also aspires and then has something that they want that they aspire to be. So perfect example would be footballers, if it was, again, stereotypically, if it was young boys, possibly supermodels, young girls, maybe, bearing in mind that's quite stereotypical because of course that's quite clearly not always the case. But then you could talk about even same sex. So same sex, so boys are more likely to copy male role models, girls are more likely to copy female role models. Age, so children are more likely to model people with their own age or ever so slightly older, so older siblings. Loads of opportunity for different examples there that you could use. So you would explain the key term and then you would provide an example. Vicarious reinforcement, so it's observing the consequences of somebody else's behaviour. And if it's and then you could give an example, and the perfect example there would be Bandura with the Bobo doll studies and Rocky. So you saw Rocky beating people up, you watched that video, the Bobo doll up, and then he received a reward of lemonade and told he was champion. It was champion behaviour. Or the other children observed him playing and he was scolded. Now remember, they went a little bit over the top on the video, so they didn't actually hit any of the children, but they were scolded. He didn't hit Rocky, but he was scolded. They saw him being scolded, and then you could talk about the likelihood of the children who saw experienced vicarious reinforcement more likely to mirror the behaviour, whereas the children who experienced vicarious punishment were less likely to model that behaviour. And then mediational process, so it's creating an internal mental representation of that behaviour and the consequence that you would receive. So they saw Rocky get the lemonade, they thought, oh, that he's been rewarded. So two things: I want that reward, and secondly, that behaviour must be a good behaviour I should replicate. Or punishment, I want to avoid that punishment, or that's a bad behaviour that I shouldn't replicate. So it's about having those internal mental understandings, which behaviourist psychologists did not acknowledge. And then we had Fox and Baleson. The most important thing that lots of people didn't do here is they didn't link it back. So you explained that there were virtual models that were loitering or that were exercising, and they were either similar or dissimilar, and they found that people were more likely to imitate the behaviour of those the similar models that were exercising, and that links into identification. So if they saw something similar in their role model to them, then they were more likely to imitate that behaviour. And then you need to link it back. So the thing lots of people didn't do was talk about identification, and then also if you have supporting evidence, it supports the validity of the theory. So you would be making a point, there was supporting research, for example, Baleson found this, what did that mean? So how does that support the theory, and then why is supporting evidence a good thing? So virtual models more likely to be copied, supports the idea of identification, explain that, and then if the supporting research, then it increases the validity of the approach we're talking about. And then causality. So causality is about what we struggled with, is if we could identify cause and effect within social learning theory. So social learning theorists say that A leads to B. So it could be that time spent with criminals leads to us observing and imitating their behaviour. Other theories, or another way of looking at it, would be flipping it on the other way around. So it might not be that you learn from those behaviours, but that you in fact are drawn to people who display the same behaviours of you. So it's not that you've observed and imitated the people around you, but you already arrived to that group of people with those behaviours. Okay, and again that reduces validity. And then another thing that it does is it ignores other factors. Some people combine those 2 points together. You need to pull them apart because you do need those 3 evaluation points. So it ignores factors of nature versus nurture, and lots of people were effectively able to tell me about testosterone and mental health issues, which was excellent, but explain that that means. So people might display aggression due to levels of testosterone, as opposed to the fact they've learned that behaviour, or people who have higher levels of testosterone might be more vulnerable to learning those behaviours, which social learning theory doesn't account for, suggesting it's an incomplete theory. There you've got all the AO1, so if you want to pause the video you can have a look at that. I would highly encourage that, particularly if you didn't get the higher marks. And then there as well you pause so you can have have a look at the AO3 marks as well for the model examples. Okay, common mistakes that were made. No evaluation at all. This was really shocking. That was 6 marks that you lost, so that could be up to 1 or 2 grade boundaries. Focusing too much on research. So the better way to approach it would be to explain the key terms and then give examples using the research to display that. So vicarious reinforcement is explain, and then for example, Bandura displayed this in his study where one person was given lemonade and rewarded and one person was scolded. Not explaining all the terminology, so you need to be aware of the terminology, you need to use all of the terminology all the way up to a mediational process to make sure you've got a note of those. Not providing examples of the terminology, as I've just said before, not using the P structure in evaluation points, and not including 3 evaluation points in the 12 marker. You must include 3 evaluation points if you want to get anywhere near the top marks. And then the most shocking and worrying one of all, talking about classical and opera and conditioning. If that's what you did, you need to pause, you need to make sure you've got loads of notes about what you would be expected to write for that. Okay? Use your knowledge of classical conditioning to explain why the young woman is terrified of balloons. Everybody here, almost, I think every single person did. This is an AO2 question and you all applied, which is excellent. Please make sure you continue to do that. Okay? So what you would have wanted to talk about is breaking it down, and the thing that lots of people didn't do was use terminology. So initially the loud noise of the bursting balloon, so it wasn't the balloon, it wasn't, make it really clear it was the loud noise and it wasn't the balloon. So initially the loud noise would have been the unconditioned stimulus and caused the unconditioned response of fear. So unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, identify those. Then identify the neutral stimulus. The balloon would have been the neutral stimulus, and then however once associated with the unconditioned stimulus, so you must use the word associated because it links in with classical conditioning. Once associated with the unconditioned stimulus would have become a conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response would have been fear. So you need to mention all of those, and this is another example of doing it. So you talk about the neutral stimulus being the balloon and there was no response, and then unconditioned stimulus was the loud noise, unconditioned response was fear. The unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus were associated, so it became the conditioned stimulus of the balloon and the conditioned response of fear. Explain 2 strengths of the behaviourist approach in psychology. That says 2 marks, but actually it was 4. So you've got that it was real-world applications, which was really good. Systematic desensitisation, which some people made reference to, but as well as that, you must also explain what systematic desensitisation is. So it's when a learnt fear response is replaced with a less anxious response. And then you must explain why that's a good thing. It's an strength because if the theory can be applied to the real world, it suggests it's high in validity. You must include all of those, because if all you say is it has real-world application, so it's high in validity, that would be 1 mark. You need to talk about systematic desensitisation and what it is for that 2nd mark. And then a strength of operant conditioning is it's based on experimental research. So for behaviourist approach, you can talk about both classical and operant conditioning. Experimental research, so for example, you all know about Skinner's box and Pavlov's dogs. I didn't see many people talk about that. And this is a strength because it allows psychologists to control all extraneous variables so they can be sure of cause and effect, going on to say increasing validity. Some people did that brilliantly, some people struggled a bit more. The basic thing I think that people struggled with was not knowing the information. Make sure you know the information, and then secondly, use the P structure to explain it. Okay, thank you very much.